to those beaten for daring to fight for freedom and democracy, for their right to worship, to speak, to live, and to prosper in the family of free nations. We say to you tonight, you are not alone, freedom fighters. America will support you with moral and material assistance. Your right not just to fight and die for freedom, but to fight and win freedom.
To carry out this promise, President Reagan frequently asked Congress to provide adequate funding to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. To back up the president's request, one member of the White House staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North, produced an informative slideshow for members of Congress and for supporters of the freedom fighters. The course of American foreign policy hangs in the balance, centering around Colonel North's slideshow. What was in that show? The show that Congress and the American public heard but never saw. In a few minutes, you will see for yourself that now famous slideshow. This video includes all 57 of Colonel North's slides, plus a 58th mystery slide, which, until now, very few Americans have seen. In addition, you will hear from some of the best qualified experts who will give you the unique inside story as to why the slideshow was so necessary. One of the key players in the administration's efforts was retired Army Colonel Larry Tracy, who, it turns out, helped inspire Colonel North's slideshow. Colonel Larry Tracy, you have considerable experience in affairs of Central America. Give us a little background about your occupation and how you got interested in it.
The desk officer, if you will, for Nicaragua, El Salvador, and a number of other Central American countries, and continued in that capacity at the Defense Department, and then I went over to the State Department on loan to the newly created Office of Public Diplomacy, where I did a lot of writing and speaking.
And I guess you were a natural when Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North was interested in putting together a presentation. Tell us how you became involved in that presentation and in what has become known as the slideshow.
When I was developing a booklet, the blue book and the silver book as they're called, I started to have slides made on the idea of making a slide presentation. So in early '86, I got a copy of Ollie's slides and I gave him a copy of mine. The slide presentation evolved from that.
Did the show stay static?
Kind of difficult to keep the slides moving as fast as the Soviet equipment has come into Nicaragua. That's one of the problems. So they're always lagging behind on how many tanks, etc. they had, because the Soviets, for instance, in the year 1986 gave almost as much military assistance to Nicaragua in that 1 year as we had given to El Salvador in 7 years. So there would always be a little bit of lag, but if anything, the slide presentation tended to understate what the Soviet presence and the Soviet threat was rather than overstate it.
How did this slideshow fit into the administration's policy?
You're not going to have a foreign policy that can be sustainable unless you have domestic support. And how do you let the public know what we're doing in Central America and why we're doing it? It's one of the reasons that the Office of Public Diplomacy was created in the State Department. It was an interagency office. For instance, I was on loan from the Defense Department. We had other people on loan there from other agencies of government. And then there was the Office of Public Liaison within the White House that also brought interested groups in. And Ollie spoke to them a lot. I spoke to them occasionally, although, as I said, I spoke most of my speeches were outside of Washington. But it was this intense effort to let the people know what was taking place. There is a tremendous threat to the United States being posed by this rather cosmic roll of the dice of the Soviets in outspending us by a factor of 10 to 1. Over the last 7 years, the Soviets have put close to $9 billion in military equipment into 2 countries, Cuba and Nicaragua. And our assistance to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica hasn't reached $1 billion yet. That's the information that the American public needs to know, and that was one of the purposes of that slide presentation. If I were, again, putting myself into the position of a Soviet military planner, I would put as much pressure as possible on this country, Mexico, because there are 80 million people there. And if they can create, the Soviets and the Cubans and the Nicaraguans could create social conditions that would drive Mexicans to leave that country, I think we would have a tremendous pressure within the Congress of the United States to bring troops back from NATO. And if that happens, the balance of power is changed, and the chess players maneuver of the Soviet Union and the tremendous economic investment they have made has paid tremendous dividends for them.
So this type of threat could perhaps be one reason why Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North became involved in a program to sell Americans on supporting the freedom fighters in
Precisely. That, and I think what motivated Ollie for this is, as with many of us who had the Vietnam experience, I spent 3 years in Vietnam, we don't want to see the same thing take place as happened in Vietnam. We would just as soon never have U.S. troops have to go there, and there would be no need for it. We've got to continue to support, and I think this is what Ollie saw. If we can generate the public support so that they know what we're doing, and they know why we're doing it, and they know what the consequences will be if we don't succeed in this, then we will not have to send troops. So they're going to have to be able to, in some way, get that aid. Now, I think what motivated Ollie was, let's send guns to Central Americans so we don't have to send sons to Central America.
You say what motivated Ollie. Why was it Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North getting involved in this as opposed to someone else? Why Ollie North?
Well, Ollie was in the position at the White House. He was as the Deputy Political Military Advisor. And Ollie, as you know, is a guy who is going to grab hold and take charge of a job. And this was just one of those things that jobs had to be done, and they were given to Ollie. One of the reasons, perhaps, that this was forced to be in the NSC was because the Boland Amendment, and I have particular views that the Boland Amendment certainly was a tremendous challenge to the President's constitutional responsibility. If I would have a criticism of the White House, is that they didn't fight it from the beginning and challenge it at that point. But it was left, and the interpretation of many was that it did not cover the NSC. So things that could have been done within the government-wide had to be reduced to being done in the NSC, and Ollie was the man that was doing it. And he was a very qualified man to handle this job. But I think this is what he felt. Knowledge is power. Get the knowledge to the public as to what is taking place, and that they will then make their feelings felt.
You were sort of an insider to the construction of that slideshow and the material that went into it. Can you give us a few little insides as to how how it was put together and who built it, and who were some of the players from the other departments who were involved in that?
Well, basically, we of course received a lot of the declassified intelligence from the intelligence community, Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. Nothing in that slide presentation was ever classified. Everything before it ever got put onto a slide, it was declassified, so it was never any violation of security or compromise of sources or methods in any way. It was while a colleague of mine in the Defense Department and I were doing these two books, the Blue Book and the Silver Book, that the slide presentation evolved. Because many of the same pictures that are in there you will find in the slide presentation. There's one in particular that I think that I was delighted to see Ollie use this, because it can show just what is the military situation.
I think you're a little too modest to tell us that you were the one who had the idea for this particular slide. Tell us how you got the idea for that, and how it came to you one night.
When I had done this book, the Blue Book, I had used bar graphs on that. And it was to show the comparison of the armed forces of the various countries of Central America. But the problem with the bar graph is that people tend to take El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and add them all up, and they outnumber Nicaragua. Of course, that does not display the reality of the thing, that there is not a unified force. So I was wondering how to portray this, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I sort of awoke with a start, and I shouted, "Little men," which caused my wife to think that I had definitely gone around the bend at that point. And I decided, it just hit me, that would be the way to do it. So I got out of bed, wrote a little sketch map, put little stick figures on, gave it to a graphics man, and that's the way it turned out after that.
Okay, let's take a look at that slideshow right now. And this is a slideshow put together primarily by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council. And the two parts you will see, one part was the original presentation in June of 1986, and the second part was done on July 14th, 1987, before the United States Congress and the American public.
The hearing will please come to order. On the matter before us, to wit the showing of the slides, I have tried my best to advise one and all that because of security considerations, the lights in this room cannot be turned off. Accordingly, the slides would not be seen either by members of the panel, and more importantly, by the people of the United States. However, I believe we have worked out something that might serve the purpose intended by Mr. Coulter. We have no desire to keep any information away from the people of the United States. It was our intention to do so, and as a result, a special room had been set aside, a special screen had been acquired, a special projector was acquired. But apparently, under the arrangement, we may not see the show. Chairman Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members will recall that Congressman Cheney had 20 minutes reserved on his time, so the chair recognizes Congressman Cheney at this time for 20 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Congressman Cheney.
I'm going to make the following request, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I ask unanimous consent that the slides that are part of Colonel North's briefing be made a permanent part of the printed record of these proceedings.
Before responding to that, I have a question. How many slides are involved, Colonel? Because I've been told that slides are selected for different purposes.
The briefing in its current format, and there were many different formats for it, of course, and we tried to update it, has 57 slides in it, Senator.
And is there a written text that accompanies the slideshow?
No, sir.
Are there notes that you refer to?
No, I would, in the format that I gave it in many times, sometimes even up here in the Hill, I would simply put the slides up on the screen and describe the slides, and of course the contents of the entire briefing demonstrated the Soviet threat in this hemisphere and how the resistance was
Fine, sir.
responding to it.
Then we are submitting 57, is that correct, Mr. Cheney?
Yes, Mr.
Without
Chairman.
objection, 57 slides will be made part of the permanent record.
Colonel North, in the time remaining to me, I would like to ask you to give us a general description of your briefing, if you will. I'm especially interested in putting on the public record as part of these hearings information about the nature and the extent of the Soviet threat in Central America and Nicaragua.
All right, sir. Perhaps the best way to do that is to simply go through the presentation as it exists.
Notice that Colonel North removed the first slide from his tray and placed it aside. That slide, which was not revealed to Congress or to the American public, was used to set the stage for Colonel North's original presentations to supporters of the Contras. This introductory slide showed the economic political changes in Latin America. One of Colonel North's presentations was made here in the old Executive Office Building in June of 1986. Exclusive videotape segments from this meeting have been edited into Colonel North's July 1987 explanations to Congress to give you a fuller understanding of his original presentation.
I'm going to ask you to watch on the screen. I've got about 45 or 50 slides that we have used in various presentations for the Congress in trying to convince them of the correctness of our policy in Central America. It is an important policy, and it is based in much regard on what you see on the screen right now. Between the Rio Grande River and the Panama Canal live between 100 and 130 million souls. Those people today struggle for a better lifestyle. There is great economic and social disparity that exists. Opportunity is not what it could and should be. And yet opportunity will not be what it could be as long as Nicaragua represents a threat to free enterprise, to democracy, to freedom of speech, and the freedom of religion to the people of all of Central America. Through the vital sea lanes of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and the Panama Canal flow most of the trade that we rely upon in this country to maintain a balance of trade. Through the vital sea lanes of the Caribbean flow 55% of the oil that we use in this country. And out through those sea lanes would flow 60 to 65% of the supplies and personnel that we would need to reinforce Europe or the Persian Gulf in the event of a conflict. Despite what a previous administration said about the decreasing importance of the Panama Canal, an increasing portion of our trade flows through that vital cut through the isthmus. In fact, As our trade with the Pacific grows and the migration of American industry continues to the southeast of the United States, we expect that that trade will increase significantly through the year 2000. The second slide is a photograph of Andrei Gromyko, then the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and a quote from Mr. Gromyko to the effect that he said in Moscow in 1983, "The region is boiling like a cauldron. Cuba and Nicaragua are living examples for the countries in that part of the world," talking about their intentions. A second quote from Marshal Ogorkov, then the head of the Soviet Armed Forces, in Moscow when he was talking to Maurice Bishop, then the head of Grenada, in which he said, a note taken by Bishop and his people in visiting Moscow in March of '83, the Marshal said, forgive me, the Marshal said that over 2 decades ago there was only Cuba in Latin America. Today there are Nicaragua, Grenada, and a serious battle is going on in El Salvador, a 1983 pronouncement by Marshal Ogorkov. There's then a summary of Soviet policy in the region. The Soviet policy toward this region is designed to cause America to withdraw from its overseas positions, both in personnel and resources, to defend itself in this hemisphere. And we see for the first time on the mainland of the hemisphere an opportunity for the Soviets and their surrogates to advance the cause of communism, to threaten the burgeoning democracies of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica. Costa Rica, the longest-term democracy south of the Rio Grande River, is indeed threatened deeply by what goes on today in Nicaragua. It is not happening by accident. The Soviets knew what they were doing and know what they are doing, and their program is well designed. The Soviets are outspending us in our own hemisphere. This year we can expect a 17 to 23% reduction in the security assistance and economic aid that we provide to the Central American democracies. Last year, the Soviets spent $4.5 billion to help their friends. We expect that this number will go up to approach $6 billion this year, at a time when we're cutting back on the aid that we're providing to the democracies. It is not by accident that the Soviets do this. They are doing it with intent, the intent to intimidate, the attempt to subvert, and the attempt to make the democracies in that region feel less secure. This photograph was taken on June 8th last year. It is a Soviet Surface Action Group photographed 14 miles off the coast of Louisiana. It is the first time the Soviets have ventured that close to with a Surface Action Group since the 1800s, when they still had colonies in what is today California. The Soviets didn't do this to intimidate the U.S. Navy. The Kiev battle group in and of itself is not a threat to the United States Navy. What it did was scare the dickens out of the Mexicans, to the point where the Mexicans almost granted, for the first time in history, a port visit to the Surface Action Group at Veracruz. It took intensive diplomatic pressure to allow the Mexicans to say no. In the opening days of World War II, Adolf Hitler sank 44% of the shipping along the east coast of the United States with diesel-powered submarines, far more primitive than this one, based 4,000 miles away. This submarine is based 118 miles from the coast of Florida. There are more of them. This is a diesel submarine provided by the Soviet Union to Cuba, more of them at this base than Hitler had off our coasts at the opening days of World War II. That's not all. The Soviets regularly fly Bear F and Bear H reconnaissance aircraft like this one from their Kola Sea Fleet, the North Sea Fleet, down across our east coast of the United States, about 12 to 13 miles off our coast, in this case being escorted by a U.S. Air Force F-4 off the Virginia Capes. And then a photograph taken by a U.S. reconnaissance platform of the Soviet military facility at San Antonio de los Baños in Cuba. It is that facility which allows the Soviets to recover their reconnaissance aircraft which fly down the east coast of the United States, and until they complete their base in Nicaragua, they are unable to do so in reconnoitering the west coast of the United States. But if one is dialing a 456 or a 395 or a Pentagon prefix or a State Department or CIA prefix on an open telephone system, that system right there, with computers which they stole from U.S. technology, shunts that call immediately with what they call a discrete dial tone indicator code into the earphones of a Soviet technician, who immediately telegraphs back to Moscow exactly what was the substance of that telephone call. I tell you that in case you're calling friends that you don't want others to know about. Ivan is listening, and he's doing it from a base about 125 miles from the United States. A photograph showing the militarization of the Cuban children, a 6th grade class out for their firing exercises. Then a photograph showing a map showing where Cuban forces, as the mercenary army of the Soviet Union, are deployed: 3,000 in Nicaragua, 400 in the Congo, 35,000 in Angola, 700 in Mozambique, 5,000 plus in Ethiopia, and 500 in Yemen. That chart would have been updated had I still been in my current employ to show the 1,500 now in South Yemen. And the fact is that the Soviets are indeed using the Cubans as a mercenary army throughout the world. We have long seen this pattern of behavior, and yet we somehow are immune to understanding it. It is rare that in our media we ever see a follow-through on this kind of prognostication. In 1982, in May specifically, the President used this photograph to describe to the American people that something was terribly wrong on the island of Grenada. He said, "We don't know all of what's going on, but what we do know from people who've gotten in their little boats and fled that island is that your average Grenadian citizen cannot go anywhere near the runway at Point Salinas, that the warehousing area and the storage facilities are completely off limits to anybody except a party member, a Cuban, a Soviet, or a Bulgarian." We did not know, and the President did not know when he used this photograph, how much of what was wrong on that island. What we found out after October 1983 was that tons and tons of munitions, some under the cover of the Cuban Economic Office, had been moved onto the island and that were being forwarded from that island to other places in the Caribbean and Latin America to sponsor terrorism and subversion against the democratic countries that we help. The next slide shows a Chinese rocket launcher, probably made in the 1950s, probably captured in Vietnam, shipped to Grenada, and then the shipping documents for that document: weapon captured in El Salvador, the shipping documents found in Grenada, showing that Grenada was being used as a location to support Soviet designs for subversion and revolution in this hemisphere. And then a photograph of the 5 secret military agreements found in Grenada after the U.S. rescue operation. Military agreements with the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, North Korea, Cuba, and Hungary. Somehow we were unable to get those things before the American people in such a way as that they understood what was really happening in this hemisphere. It has not only happened in Cuba, it is now happening in Nicaragua. And this today is the poor, tortured country of Nicaragua. In this country today, you see the only nation in Latin America with a decreasing population. This is not some profound program of birth control. This is the mass evacuation of thousands and thousands of their citizens fleeing what has become the largest standing army in the most oppressed state in all of Latin America. People are the principal export, and those who don't go are brought into an organized society that must include the largest standing military organization that's ever been seen in Central America. The active military is now 75,000. This slide was made a little bit over a month ago. In the reserves and militia, you have another 100,000, armed, equipped, and organized, and ready to do battle. The combined total of personnel, munitions, and equipment outweighs all that of the rest of Latin America. Excuse me, Central America, all of their neighbors. What is the purpose, one asks, of this military? In point of fact, the purpose of a large army is essential to any communist state. The purpose is to intimidate and indoctrinate. Intimidate your own people, intimidate your neighbors, and by sure, indoctrinate your people. To create the new social order. In fact, It is now a common lexicon in Nicaragua to refer to the new Nicaraguan man, almost identical to the new Soviet man or the new Hungarian man or the new East German man. The new Soviet man grows up in a society that is being radically changed by the Soviets and their mentors, and the Sandinistas are playing right into their hands. There is no intent, nor has there been any intent, to change that. Militaries are often used to change the social order. The next series of slides shows some of the military equipment on which I've already been questioned, but it shows the T-55 tanks now numbering over 150, the PT-76 tanks and the armored personnel carriers numbering over 300, the buildup taken from reconnaissance platforms at Sandino Airfield, turned from a civilian air facility under Somoza into one of the most sophisticated military facilities in Central America. This is the armored storage area at El Tempisque, built along the Cuban model. The special airfields built by the Soviets to support and the Cubans to support the Sandinista military operations along the northern tier of that country. The construction of another armored storage area inside Nicaragua. The construction of a major port facility along the Pacific coast in order to handle the offload of Soviet military supplies being delivered along the Pacific coast at Corinto. 2 shots of that. A photograph of the Soviet and Bulgarian, Cuban construction being conducted at Punta Huete along the Atlantic coast. For the first time, the Soviets will have the ability not only to deliver, they can do it pierside. The El Bluf port facility, which you see on the screen right now, is being readied as an Atlantic coast sea and naval and air facility, which will be able to accept, for example, submarines like you saw earlier. That airfield right there isn't large enough to support something like the Bear F and Bear H reconnaissance aircraft, but this one is. The Punta Huete airport is designed to look like a fighter base. In fact, it's built to Soviet fighter base specifications, except for 2 things. Even though the revetments are made and sized for a MiG-25, the runway is about 2,000 feet longer than a normal fighter base. When it's completed, this runway will probably be about 4,000 meters long, 42 meters wide, and 1 meter thick in reinforced steel and concrete. Despite the fact that this country used to be a net food exporter and is now a net food importer, the concrete of this country doesn't go to improve the ability of their cooperative farms or their state-run industries. It goes into this facility at the direction of some higher master than even the Sandinista junta itself. This runway, made to look like a fighter base for a country that doesn't even have fighters, is capable of accepting, launching, and recovering any aircraft in the Soviet inventory, to include their strategic backfire bomber. We truly do not know what they intend for that runway. That's not all. They have provided the most advanced helicopter assault fleet in the world, or in this part of the world. El Salvador, which has the next largest helicopter fleet, has nothing to compete with the things that you're going to see on this slide and the next. This is the Mi-8 assault helicopter. It's the workhorse of the Soviet Air Force and Soviet assault regiments. The helicopter was shipped as an Mi-17 crop duster, an agricultural support aircraft. You'll notice the agricultural support personnel in front of it. The agricultural 2.75-inch rocket launcher is just forward of the party emblem. And these agricultural support personnel are out chasing down the hated Contra. They're also using the Mi-24 Hind D, the so-called flying tank. This is the most sophisticated and effective airborne assault platform in the world today. The United States has nothing to match this aircraft. These same aircraft are used by Soviet pilots to murder the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, by Soviet and Cuban pilots to murder Jonas Savimbi's UNITA in Angola, and Eritrean rebels in Ethiopia. And today, flown by Soviet technicians after assembly and Nicaraguan and Cuban pilots in the attack, they're being used to drive the Contra back across the border. There's also a photograph of a Soviet AN-30 reconnaissance aircraft flown by Soviets in this hemisphere, not Cubans, not Nicaraguans, marked neatly with Aeroflot markings on the side, photographed surreptitiously from an aircraft landing at Sandino Airport. some quotes from the Ortega brothers and the band of folks down in in Nicaragua, in which somehow we have been unable to explain to the American people what their real intent was in bringing about this revolution. And I think the quotes are important because it really does depict what they've been saying all along. In 1981, Humberto Ortega, the defense minister, interestingly enough, a mirror image of what is going on in Cuba. The minister of defense in Cuba is the brother of Fidel Castro. The minister of defense in Nicaragua is the brother of El Presidente, Daniel Ortega. Humberto has said, Marxism-Leninism is the scientific doctrine that guides our revolution. Our doctrine is Marxism-Leninism. And he said that in August of 1981. And what he is saying in every other word is that communism is what they want. And this was being said at a time when we somehow couldn't explain to the American people effectively that these people really were communists, and they were all along. Bayardo Arce, any investment project in our country belongs to the state. The bourgeoisie no longer exists, it subsists. 1984. The great political thinker, the Che Guevara in many respects of the current revolution in Nicaragua. Tomas Borge, the Minister of Interior. He doesn't run the national parks, he runs the secret police. You cannot be a true revolutionary in Latin America without being a Marxist-Leninist, said in Havana in 1984. And then two photographs of Mr. Ortega and some of his associates, one with Fidel Castro, and then with some of his other brothers in arms, in this case, the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, shown with Tomas Borge and the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Miguel Descoto, along with Mr. Gaddafi on the deck of a Korean gunboat. The next three slides are taken of an automobile which had an automobile accident in Honduras on the 10th of December, 1985. It was an accident. The car drove into a bridge abutment. The male and female passengers were severely injured, taken to a hospital. The doctor, as he was about to anesthetize the female passenger, who was carrying Costa Rican documents, Costa Rican license plate on the car, it's incidentally a Lada, a Soviet-built automobile. As she was being anesthetized, she began to mutter in Russian. The doctor called the police. The police went back out and opened up the car. They found 16 secret compartments. Inside those secret compartments were 16 East German radios, Soviet and East German code books, Bulgarian printed counterfeit U.S. currency, and letters to Guatemalan and Salvadoran insurgents from their friends and mentors in Bulgaria, East Germany, and the Soviet Union. Did you ever see this in the American papers? It was all over the Latin American papers, and yet one newspaper that I know of, when provided with a briefing on this by Assistant Secretary Elliott Abrams, covered it at all, and that was the Washington Times. And after all, who reads that? These are the weapons found after the assault by the terrorist organization M19 against the Palace of Justice in Bogota, Colombia. All 11 Supreme Court justices were murdered as the Supreme Court was taking up hearings on financial sources of the narco-terrorist organization M19. When the M19 finished, 37 weapons were found among the 53 dead guerrillas and the other 100 and some odd dead and wounded Colombians. Of those 37 weapons, 37 were found to have originated in Nicaragua, and yet that has never been reported in our newspapers. Then a photograph that starts a series on what has happened to the people of Nicaragua. A photograph of one of the 11 new political prisons inside Nicaragua. A photograph of one of the victims with his arms and face terribly burned from having been truss-bound, thrown into his Pentecostal church, and set afire while he was alive. And he managed to push himself out of the church. A photograph from a Nicaraguan school book printed in East Germany or Cuba, showing how young Nicaraguan children learned to count by counting grenades and AK-47. And of course the textbooks talk about anti-imperialism and anti-Americanism. A photograph of some remarkable quality, showing an entire town which fled in their Sunday best across the border simply to go to church on Sunday, wearing everything that they had because they could never go back home. A series of photographs showing the dislocation of the Mosquito Indians, 25,000 to 30,000 of which have been driven from tribal homelands across the border into Costa Rica and Honduras, bringing with them their entire culture. Left alone for hundreds of years, these people no longer can go home. Then some photographs showing the Nicaraguan resistance. It shows the young men and women who have taken up arms because they've been denied any other recourse in their own country. It shows the 57-year-old coffee farmer who I described earlier, who came home and found his entire family murdered by the Sandinistas because they gave water to a passing Contra patrol. A series of photographs showing how the resistance looks as a consequence of the assistance I am accused and admit to having delivered. A photograph showing the leadership of the FDN. And in that photograph of 16 men, 11 of them are former Sandinistas. A photograph of a resistance unit crossing into Nicaragua, another one of a patrol deep inside Nicaragua, a photograph of a wounded resistance soldier who benefited from the support that we provided during the cutoff, and then a photograph of what it looked like before that help arrived. A photograph of the emergency aid station and intensive care unit, which is nothing more than a field tent without even mosquito netting. A photograph of the plastic maps that they were forced to draw their own battle plans and patrol routes on because we couldn't even give them that. And then finally a photograph showing the grave of a resistance fighter. And the conclusion of the briefing is, gentlemen, that we've got to offer them something more than the chance to die for their own country and the freedoms that we believe in. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Colonel North.
In the days following Colonel North's testimony, there were a number of publications and videotapes that tried to answer quickly and perhaps superficially some of the remaining questions. Now we're going to try to bring you a few of those answers in depth. When Colonel North made his presentation to Congress, he took the first slide out of his slide tray and placed it upside down on the witness table. Was that a mystery slide?
No, it really wasn't a mystery slide, Walt. I think the reason that Ollie did that, I'm very familiar with that slide. It was a map of Latin America in 1976, all Central and South America, and 1986, showing the tremendous progress of democracy. I think the reason that Ollie took it out was he was talking basically about Central America, and this covered Central and South America. Probably was too much data at that time to put out. I think he should have shown it because that's one of the great accomplishments of U.S. foreign policy, that in 1976, 2/3 of the people of Latin America were living under dictatorial rule. Now we have around 90% of the people of Latin America living under democracy of some form.
Do you think Colonel North went a little too far, or he did the right thing?
He has testified under oath, and I believe him, that he did not engage in any fundraising, but there were civilian groups, private sector groups, that were indeed doing that, and I personally find nothing the matter with that. I think elements of the United States Congress were indeed irresponsible in the way they failed to match with their strong anti-communist words the funds to support those that were fighting our fight for us, the Nicaraguan resistance movement. And I think Ollie had a deep passion of that, and I think it was motivated to a great degree by his own experience in Vietnam. He didn't want to see us abandon the resistance movement like we've abandoned other people in the world. So, no, I wouldn't say that's going too far at all.
Colonel Tracy, some people have criticized sending American aid to the Contras. They've called it immoral. What's your answer to that?
Well, I think it would be immoral to abandon the Nicaraguan people to the fate that has befallen them in the last 7 or 8 years. Somoza was bad. I mean, this was a brutal, cruel, corrupt dictator. But we didn't have 350,000 Nicaraguans deciding to flee the country under Somoza. They had done that under the Sandinistas. Somoza had people in jail, but he didn't have 1 out of 300, and that's what it is in Nicaragua right now. There are 10,000 political prisoners. 1 out of every 300 Nicaraguans is behind bars, in jail for their political beliefs. I think the morality of it is something that is solidly on our side. And to me, this is a very important element from a personal standpoint. My brother-in-law is a missionary priest in Latin America. I'm a practicing Catholic, and it's a very important part of my life. Now, it's a very important point in which the Sandinistas have recognized the importance in the United States of public opinion and the moral question, as you brought up, Walt. Thomas Borge, for example, the Minister of Interior, is the master manipulator of public opinion in the United States, specifically when it comes to religious groups and the moral question. We had a man that defected from Nicaragua a couple of years ago, a man named Alvaro Baldizón. He was a top-level aide to Borge. And one of the things that he told us was that Borge has a special office in which he receives American religious visitors. It has crucifixes and Bibles and other religious artifacts. Borge himself quotes the Bible, and people walk away thinking, what a mysterious man this is. He seems to be a socialist, some will even say a communist, but he also seems to know Christianity so well. But that's not where Borge carries out his main work. He's got another office where he has pictures of Marx, Lenin, Engels, and no American visitors ever get into that office. And an awful lot of compassionate Americans who really want to do well for the Nicaraguan people have been manipulated and misled by that. Another thing that they're concerned about, and it gets to the heart of your question on the morality of the Contras, the atrocities that the Contras are alleged to have carried out. This is a peasant army. Most of the soldiers in there are 18 or 19, and they've joined because they're angry at the Sandinistas for something. But the same defector, Baldizón, told us another interesting story, and that was that Borge has special units. They've been trained in East Germany, they wear the uniform of the Contra, and their specific mission is to carry out atrocities so that they will be blamed on the Contras. And they make sure that the American Human Rights Organization and journalists are going to see that. So I don't think we can ever be sure of what is happening down there as far as the atrocities.
Other critics of American aid have cited the fact that the Catholic Church stands beside Daniel Ortega and his group. What is the truth?
Well, the Catholic Church in Nicaragua is split. You have a minority. They are called the Popular Church, but it's very, very much of a minority. The majority of the priests, all of the bishops, are with Cardinal Obando y Bravo, who is the man who in 1978 said to the Nicaraguan people, you have not only the right, you have the obligation to rebel against Somoza. He hasn't changed. He is still against dictatorship. But the Sandinistas fear him. I think they fear him more than the 20,000 Contras, because this is a great spiritual leader. And that really represents the Catholic Church in Nicaragua.
What choices do we have in combating communism in Central America?
Do we provide aid in sufficient amount to the democratic countries of Central America and democratic movements such as the resistance movement in Nicaragua? Or do we back off and not have that pressure at all and put our faith in the words and the good faith of the Sandinistas? I think that if we listen to the words of many members of Congress who are opposed to Contra aid, they're saying no Soviet bases in that area. So I think what we simply must do is provide aid to the resistance movement now. In other words, send guns to Central Americans now so we don't send our sons to Central America later.
Colonel Tracy, thank you very much for providing us with your valuable insights. It is essential for Americans to truly understand the importance of Colonel North's slide presentation concerning the potential for disaster in Central America. Therefore, we have obtained additional unique insights from other experts. Our moderator is Steve Trevino, Director of Operations for the U.S. Global Strategy Council. The Council has over 200 top strategy experts to encourage a consistent, bipartisan strategy, which is essential for American security.
Reed, you've been very involved with the Accuracy in Media organization over the years, taking a look at the media accounting. It seems that America is asking the question, why is it that we haven't heard this information before?
Comes down to the fact that the reporters and the editors, the people who are responsible for deciding what is news and what isn't, have their own agenda. The polls, including
America, has consistently tilted towards revolutionary groups, organizations, and individuals in Latin America. They were the principal purveyors of these three reports, which were in fact prepared hand in glove with the Sandinista government. I'm the author of a book, The Real Secret War, Sandinista Propaganda and the U.S. Congress. The information in these reports is either not credible, it's distorted, or it's fabricated. These reports have been challenged, have been contradicted, and have been shown to be incorrect by people who are in the field themselves, by independent investigators, and by defectors, most importantly by defectors from the Sandinista government themselves.
Why is it that the media insists on picking up that kind of a story as opposed to the kind of testimony that we heard Oliver North give to the Congress and the American public?
When these people that are pushing out this drug story hold a press conference, you'll get an army of reporters and television cameras there to cover it. There was one in Washington. They had to wait for 2 hours for the press conference to even begin. And when it came out, it turned out there was nothing there. But that draws huge crowds.
When we do give press conferences, the wire services will frequently pick it up. Newspapers out in what I like to call the real America, they'll pick it up and they'll run those stories. But the major media that mold opinion here in the United States, they simply consistently ignore information which contradicts their mindset and their ideological predilections.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think it's very important for the American public to understand exactly what this phenomena is concerning Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and even more importantly, why he felt that he had to do what he did. So again, thank you very much. We're going to continue our discussion on the LA Times editorial piece, which has been critical of U.S. policy in Nicaragua. Now, we're very fortunate today, in addition to Colonel Tracy, to have retired Colonel Sam Dickens of the American Security Council. That unique organization includes over 265,000 individual members nationwide, 255 congressional members participating, and approximately 165 participating organizations. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of exactly what American Security Council is doing on Nicaragua right now, Sam?
Yes, well, we've been putting considerable focus on Central America and support to the freedom fighters, I think, since '81. And right now we're just at the point of delivering a strategic plan for democratization and freedom in Nicaragua. And some of the elements that go into that is that breaking diplomatic relations with the Nicaraguan government. And once that's done, because we really should go back to the Organization of American States and that session number 17, when they conferred legitimacy on the Sandinistas made all sorts of promises, and they haven't kept any of the promises. So we should go back to the OAS and say, let's withdraw recognition, break diplomatic relations with Nicaragua, and then come forward and recognize the freedom fighters as the legitimate government of Nicaragua.
Until the testimony by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the American public was not that aware of the Soviet presence in that country. Could both of you, Sam, perhaps you start?
Colonel Oliver North brought this out very well in the slides. The development of the infrastructure that's gone into Nicaragua. You can't look at that without seeing that there's been a tremendous investment of the Soviet Union's and Cuba's right in Nicaragua. Oliver North pointed out this Punta Huete, and it was a meter-deep runway. That runway was not just designed for fighters. It's designed to take the heaviest bomber in the Soviet inventory. In January, late January of this year, I went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and stated it isn't that it's about to become a Soviet base, it is a Soviet base now. And some of the senators looked at me rather strangely because they said, well, where are the Soviet troops and facilities? I mean, besides the facilities and the infrastructure. And I said, it's very much like our forward deployment in Europe that I've had some experience in, several years there. And every summer we have exercises where we deploy Army troops and Air Force wings, and they go to pre-positioned sites. The runways are there, the logistics are there, the fuel's there, the bombs are there, but all it waits to put this into activation is the deployment. The Soviets have laid the infrastructure within Nicaragua. They've got 75 to 100 Soviet military there. The East Germans run their security apparatus inside the country. We've got thousands of Cuban military and other civilian Cubans that are there, so it's all set. So all it takes is that 45-minute flight from Cuba with their Soviet Bear bombers and Soviet MiG-23s, and a 45-minute flight into Puerto Cabezas, Punta Huete, and 5 air bases in total that would take jet fighters, and then it is a base, just like that, 45 minutes.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. We're extremely fortunate to have with us one of the original foot soldiers in the case being made right now, and very eloquently, by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, in a phenomena that is the U.S. foreign policy and what should our objectives be in Nicaragua. And that is Congressman Bob Dornan, who has spent many years pleading the case for U.S. assistance to the Nicaraguan resistance. Let's talk about the Ollie North phenomenon and the briefing that he has given recently. What has been the effect of that briefing on Congress itself?
The effect has been nothing short of astounding. I still think that the maybe 60%, 70% of North's impact was what he said. What the message, if he had some sleazeball message, I don't care how handsome his gap-toothed smile was, or how straight his jaw was, or how impressively he put across his message, or took his lumps and stood tall. It wasn't just that.
Let's talk about the information aspect of this. What about the facts?
Let me cross your T's. We've had this one for over 2 years. It's superb. It's documented with hardcore intelligence photographs, some of which I begged Assistant Secretary Elliott Abrams to declassify so that we would have the armor to help carry the debate on the floor. This one was created by an Army Lieutenant Colonel Larry Tracy, where you interviewed him, recently retired. Thank God he's in the private sector with the full force of his First Amendment rights. This book has been around for over a year and some months, and the bottom line here is this. Communist propaganda and disinformation is being brought to the House floor by members of Congress who naively think what they're presenting are an opposite set of facts. They don't understand that they're presenting hardcore communist garbage that starts on the desk of the Ortega brothers, or really on the desk of the main communist theoretician down there, Tomás Boré. It's laundered through the Christic Institute or Witness for Peace or some of these naive religious groups, and it's put in the hands of congressmen and women, and they bring it to the floor to counter all of this.
Are there congressmen who really do understand the facts you've talked about and that Ollie North talked about, but have traded their votes for other considerations?
Oh, the pork factor. You asked that question, and I smell bacon. Are there people you mean who want to come down to the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, what about my water project? What about my highway project? The sad answer is yes. And Americans ought to know that our president is frustrated when confronted with somebody who says, I buy your case, I understand, I don't want to see communism win, but what's in it for me? That's terrible. And that's again why we must have a bipartisan foreign policy that doesn't get mixed in to domestic wheeling and dealing, or to put it in a better light, the compromising that goes on domestic issues that should never infringe on a fight for freedom anywhere in the world.
Let's develop a hypothetical situation. The Congress does not approve the aid, in whatever package form it's going to appear. And the Sandinistas continue as they are, and Soviet strategy perseveres in the region. What do you see?
In 2 or 3 years, 4 years, we may look back and go, oh my God, we've got Soviet Bear bombers flying up and down the Pacific coast, flying out there in the Gulf of Mexico. We've got Soviet combat task force in what used to be an American lake, the Gulf of Mexico. This happened in Indochina. Now we've got this big Soviet base at Cam Bay, Soviet deep water ships in the harbor at Da Nang. Every projection that people said, at its worst, a genocide of 2.5 million people in Cambodia, 600,000 people dead on the South China Seas, 68,000 people executed by death lists who were friends of ours in Vietnam, and 10,000 of our best friends still in concentration camps in Indochina. All of that nightmare took place, but it didn't happen right away. We better pay attention to what's happening right here on the front porch, our front lawn, our fellow Americans, and not just write off the poor people inside Nicaragua for openers that, well, they can live with the system they want. They don't want communism. Liberals who say that are inherently immoral in what they're trying to present to their fellow citizens, that these people want this communist decay that they have in Nicaragua. We have a moral obligation to free those people. And no American kids are being asked to die to do that. All we're being asked to do is to help these peasant kids that are trying to fight for their own freedom. And their young officers who were in their early 20s or teenage years when the Sandinista victory threw out the oligarch Somoza. There's so many lies being spread around that the bottom line is here. Are you going to listen to these compelling arguments, or are you going to be subjected to information that you don't know where it comes from, but that this congressman is telling you with all the fiber of my being? It's coming off the propaganda communist ministry desk of Tomás Boré, R.C., Bayardo R.C., and all of the other Leninists who twisted this revolution around and stole the freedom from the people before they could even have one decent election. It's just a total replay of Castro, and the United States is either leader of the free world, or we're just going to be cowards and retreat from this battle that destiny's put in our lap.
Congressman Dornan, for all of the concerned Americans who are watching this presentation and are moved by the facts and the presentation they've heard, what would you ask them to do?
Please, my fellow American citizens, do a little homework, just a little. Become more comfortable with these issues than you were before you watched this compelling young Marine officer who seems to have temporarily won the hearts of his fellow countrymen. Let Ollie North's thoughts get into your head and try and deepen the understanding. Learn both sides of the issue. I don't care if you listen to the communist arguments. When you can argue this on both sides, then you've mastered the issue. But one side is freedom, and I'm sorry, the other side is the communist pitch. And some of my friends in Congress, who I truly like as colleagues, they bought the communist line and they push it on the House floor, and that's a tragedy, not only for our country, it's a tragedy for the world, and it's really a tragedy for the people inside Nicaragua. One of the things that still bothers me is we have never expressed proper gratitude to Colonel North.
Congressman Dornan, after listening to your presentation and also the testimony of the four experts that we had on earlier, I'm absolutely convinced that all of America owes a very strong debt of gratitude to what Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North has done for us.
Steve, I agree. And there's one way, one small way, to pay back this debt we owe, what he's done for his country and the free world, and that's to make sure that we keep funding those young people fighting for freedom that he worked so hard for.